Hi everybody, this is Carol Sherwood. Thank you for joining me at Steven Avery, The Devil is in the Details. I'm going to do a series on telephone calls because phone records don't lie. You've heard me say that before, and they don't. Somebody called, somebody answered or didn't, and vice versa. It's all recorded, and the telephone company isn't going to change that information. It's just recorded as is. There's some very valuable information in the phone records of Teresa Halbach, Auto Trader, and several others in this case. In my opinion, Steve Speckman is the most critical phone call in this case, besides the one that was at 227, supposedly Auto Trader, which I don't believe was Auto Trader. We'll cover that in another call. Steve Speckman called Auto Trader on 10/28. All right, so Teresa went missing on 10/31. Steve called on 10/28. It's in the records of the Auto Trader telephone records. He spoke with whoever on that phone for over 8 minutes. He details later on in an interview, he details that when he called, he was calling to see about making appointments for photographing some vehicles, at least one, maybe two, unsure at that point. But during his conversation with whoever he visited with, he talked about the photographers and what they do and stuff, because he says in that interview he thought it might be something kind of interesting that his wife might be interested in doing to make some extra money or whatever. So there is record of Steve Speckman making that phone call and having a chit-chat conversation. What's interesting is I have not seen a report, and I've looked, regarding who was on the other end. Was it Angela Schuster? Was it Dawn Pliska? Was it Rachel Higgs? Was there other people, or were there other people in that office at the time in Hales Corners? Because that's where he called. So we don't know, and I think that's a bit strange in itself that we don't even know the person that Speckman had an 8+ minute phone call with. And I'll tell you what I think that it's strange that we don't know that is because I think that they're hoping that Speckman never came into the picture at all. It'd be easier just to forget Speckman existed, but it can't be forgotten, because once that got known that he had talked to Teresa, then you can't make it go away. So here's what happens. On 10/31, Speckman is waiting for Teresa at their appointment, or at his perceived appointment. When he left that phone call back on 10/28, he thought he was making an appointment, obviously for Monday, and somewhere around the noon hour, because that's when he called back in to find out why the photographer did not show. So whoever was on the other end of that phone call of his didn't schedule an appointment, didn't put one of those logins to give Teresa a heads up, hey, this guy needs a call, or this is an appointment in Sheboygan. So she didn't get any of that. The person on the phone didn't get it, whether it just got distracted just because of a long phone call or what have you, but that never went in the system. So Teresa knew nothing about Steve Speckman. He called at like 12:43. He called and he said the photographer never showed. Sidebar, you know that story about Rachel Higgs saying Steven Avery, she overheard Steven Avery say that the photographer never showed? This is the Steven. Rachel Higgs' story is a bunch of bull, and we'll cover that on another phone call anyway. So Speckman calls in. He says the photographer didn't show, and they are like, we don't know. Let me give you Teresa's number, the lady that covers that area, and you call her. So he turns right around and he calls Teresa to find out what's up. Why didn't she show? Speckman says Teresa was driving and had to check her calendar. All right. We already know from the Denise Coakley call that was previous to that Denise also said Teresa was driving, and she said she needed to pull over to check her calendar. I don't think there's any reason why Teresa wouldn't have pulled over to check her calendar when she was talking to Speckman. So obviously she was a safe driver and she pulled over to check her calendar. That's an assumption of mine. It doesn't say that in a report, but Speckman did say she was driving and that she would check her calendar. This is why I believe that the day planner was in the car with Teresa. Not just because of the phone call, but the writing on that day planner is down in the left bottom hand corner, like someone jotted a note to remind themselves later. You can see on the day planner when it's printed out, some stuff's typed on there, appointments and things that she has, and then she's written some stuff. So when she printed that out the night before and she filled in some stuff, or maybe that morning while she was getting ready and she filled in some stuff, then there's some handwriting on there that obviously wasn't already typed on the calendar for that week. So it appears that she operates in her businesses with a week at a time calendar, so she can see each day and what she's got coming and going, and then if she needs to fill in stuff and then go back and put it in her Palm Pilot or wherever else she keeps it. So if you look at that page and you look at that handwriting about Steve Sheboygan, it's Steve's phone number, 2 vehicles, trucks, Monday, with Speckman saying in his interviews later, I called her, she said she was already leaving the area to head to another appointment. He said in another interview that if he could make it within like the next 30 minutes, then she could do it, but otherwise they'd have to reschedule. He said he could not make it. He was already gone from the site where the vehicles were, and he couldn't do it in that time frame. So that right there tells us at 12:45, when Speckman called her, and they had about a 3-minute conversation, when he called her, she was somewhere in the area that she knew she could carve out 30 minutes to go back to wherever Speckman was in the Sheboygan area, and then leave in order to make her next appointment. And remember, Speckman called before she went to the Schmitz appointment. So she hasn't gone to Kiel yet. All right, so I know everybody lives and breathes by those tower pings, but I'm going to tell you, look up the reliability of them. Look at the oddball things that happen with some of those, and I don't think that that's necessarily correct. And it certainly is not admissible in court as fact and guarantee, because you also have 2 eyewitnesses who have given affidavits to Kathleen Zellner that both of them spoke to Teresa, and both of them say she was on the phone driving. She told them she was driving. So all these people that say she was at her house until after then and that she left that day planner, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. But I want to take you past that a little bit, because there's another very interesting point about Speckman that I want you to know. When Wiegert and Leslie Lemieux go to Karen Halbach's home and Teresa's home that she shares with Scott, that was after 5:30. Okay? So, let's go back to when Karen called 911. Karen called 911 at 2:52. So we'll just say 3 o'clock. All right? It's just easier to remember that way. So Karen calls at 3 o'clock to report her daughter missing. So the police and everybody are just finding out about all of this at that moment. All right? Now, what's interesting is if you go look at phone records, and I'll go to Scott Blettern's phone records at 4:10, 1 hour and 10 minutes after Scott calls Speckman. All right? What's interesting is you can say, well, Ryan and all them were there and they were making phone calls. Nope, not yet. Not yet. You know why? Because Scott called Ryan at 4:06. And when you go look at Ryan's phone records, Ryan immediately turned around and called Teresa. Of course, he didn't get an answer, but Ryan wasn't at Teresa's house when Scott called him at 4:06. So Ryan calls Teresa. He's going to go over to Scott's and Teresa's later, in a little while. But Scott, as far as we know, is at that house by himself at 4:10 when he calls Steve Speckman. When Mark Wiegert and Leslie Lemieux get to the house at 5:30ish, right in that time frame, and he says some friends of hers came over and Scott was there and Ryan was there, and they pulled a phone record of Teresa's. And remember all the guessing the password and all that stuff, all that baloney they gave in court? Well, hold on a minute. Because the only way for Scott to call Steve Speckman at 4:10 is if Scott himself had access to those last few calls that Teresa made. So, those that believe that day planner was at the house say, well, Scott got it off the day planner, that she left it at the house and he got it off the day planner. Okay? If Teresa had that with her in her car when she went missing, then that day planner never should have gotten back to the home that she shared with Scott Blettern. So I want you to understand something. I'm not saying Scott Blettern killed Teresa at all. I have no idea what happened with all that. I do not know. But I do know that those phone records show Scott is there by himself and Scott calls Steve Speckman at 4:10. And Ryan's not there, and Kelly's not there, and Lisa's not there, and any other friends are not there, and neither is Wiegert, and neither is Lemieux, because none of them have gone over there yet. That leaves some questions unanswered as to how did Scott know Steve Speckman's phone number already. There are people who believe that Teresa got back home. And if she got back home, it would make sense the day planner was with her and was at her home. But that would mean that Scott Bledern had access to that day planner by 4:10. Because remember, Steve Speckman doesn't exist on Auto Trader's system, on Teresa Halbach's appointments, on anything right now except two places. One is the day planner, and two is on her last calls on her telephone. So there's only two places he could have gotten that number from, and one would have been he'd already gotten somehow access to her phone records, or he had the day planner. Speckman's phone records, as it relates to Auto Trader and Teresa Halbach, and the timing of all of this is highly, highly significant. And I want to say it one more time. Scott Bledern called Steve Speckman at 4:10, an hour and 10 minutes after Karen Halbach had made a 911 phone call to the sheriff's department to report Teresa missing. So how did Scott get Speckman's phone number when Speckman was nowhere in the client appointments at all? Just something to think about. Those little nuggets. Those little nuggets. Phone records tell a story, and phone records don't lie.